All right. Well, we'll come back to the scenario, but I understand you've had some lively discussions about Nigel Bigger, and I'm going to offer a few words just to close off that conversation before we turn full attention to our topic for today: resistance, revolution, and reconciliation. So, as we've seen, the mainstream of the Christian tradition has thought that it is possible, if difficult, to go to war justly and to wage war justly. It has considered torture beyond the pale, right? That's been a rare Christian thinker that would justify torture. That is not to say that there have not been many Christians who've participated in torture, right? That's the reality of human fallenness. But to actually try to justify it. Why? Because it's been seen as clearly inconsistent with love of neighbor, clearly inconsistent with human dignity as created in the image of God. But of course, that doesn't settle difficult questions about exactly which forms of interrogation are permissible or what constitutes cruel punishment versus non-cruel forms of punishment. And Bigger is unusual in taking on these questions. He's unusual in actually probing that issue. And he's extremely unusual in arguing that we can respect the dignity of others, not just say, as Augustine would have it, we can love our enemy in killing our enemy if that's the only way to protect the innocent, right, to stop the enemy advance. But Nigel Bigger argues that we can respect the dignity of others, not just in violently coercing the unjust, but also in violently coercing the innocent. So I want to just spend a minute looking at his discussion of this case from the Rwandan genocide, which is where he makes this argument. And one of the things that's really noteworthy about it is that he's trying to construct an argument that's not consequentialist for taking the life of the innocent directly or violently coercing the innocent. So this case concerns a Tutsi man, Venuste Hakimazungu, who was ordered by the Hutu to kill his older brother, Theoneste. And the idea was that if he killed his older brother, it would save the lives of the rest of the family members. So this wasn't about saving his life per se, it was about saving the family by directly killing his older brother. And the question is, was this murder? And was it wrong? Right? And so the first move that Bigger makes is to say it wasn't murder because Theoneste consented. He said, yes, go ahead and kill me to save the lives of our family. But then Bigger goes farther, and he argues that even if the older brother had not consented, he had an obligation to surrender his life for the sake of his family. This is an obligation of charity, he calls it. So in this case, his right to life, his right not to be harmed, was taken away even though he was innocent. So he can be killed even as he is loved. His brother loves him, but can permissibly take his life. And in doing so, the younger brother is respecting, is not just loving his brother, is respecting the dignity of his brother. Because his dignity is being respected by regarding him as subject to this obligation, the obligation to spend oneself in the service of intrinsically worthwhile goods, in this case, right, the preservation of the family. Just as Jesus flourishes as far as is humanly possible in horrible, horrible circumstances by giving his life up on the cross, so also Theoneste, the argument goes, flourishes and lives well in giving up his life for the sake of his family. He flourishes in being killed by his own brother, even if he doesn't consent to being killed. All right, so many concerns, I think, could be raised about this case. How in the world did Venuste know that killing his brother would actually save his family? How did he know that he would not be required next to kill one after another after another? I mean, this was terrorist violence. This is not violence that has any rationale, right? There's no particular thing to be gained by saving or killing one or the other person. It's just terror. We might say that in such horrific circumstances, he really couldn't be faulted for doing pretty much anything, right? Whatever he does, how could we fault him? But do we want to construct Christian ethics on the basis of such an extreme and horrific case? In any case, it's not clear to me that Theonest has an obligation to sacrifice himself for his family. It might be very admirable for him to sacrifice himself for his family. It's not clear to me that it's an obligation, but we could have an argument about that. It's even less clear to me that anyone else, including his brother, is justified in killing him. I don't see how we can coerce someone into sacrificing themselves. If we coerce, we can kill them. The younger brother can kill the older brother, but is that really inducing the older brother to sacrifice himself? Sacrifice seems to me to be inherently an intentional action, a free action on the part of a person. So if the consent is not there, it doesn't seem to me that there is a successful act of self-sacrifice here. So we might perhaps say that Theonest could flourish, could live well in sacrificing himself for his family, but he can't flourish and live well just in being killed by his brother in a circumstance like this. And I worry that this is the sort of case that gives casuistry a bad name, even as I respect Nigel Biggar for trying to find a non-consequentialist way of thinking his way into this. I mentioned last time that Biggar is heavily influenced by Reinhold Niebuhr. So just to kind of underscore that again, Biggar thinks most Christians idealize too much. They don't want to look the horrors of the world in the eye. And so he's dedicated to thinking through this kind of hard case. And that's one way to argue in response to this. Another is to say we don't make good ethics by thinking about how one responds in this sort of an extremity. Any thoughts people have that you want to share about that? I don't know whether you focused on this scenario in a section or in your reading. There's a lot going on in that essay, but it's such an unusual way to argue through a case. Certainly could bear a lot of reflection. I just wanted to touch on it briefly. If you have further thoughts down the line, I'd be happy to have a conversation about that at any point. All right, so we've talked a little bit about torture. We've talked about just war. Today we turn our attention to revolution, rebellion, resistance, violent resistance. Can violent resistance be justified in the name of Christian ethics? And if so, on what grounds? Or should Christians eschew violent resistance against specifically unjust civil authorities? Should Christians embrace complete non-resistance to evil? Or should Christians embrace nonviolent resistance, nonviolent forms of resistance? So I've got a scenario here for you to read and think about and discuss a little bit, and we'll then hopefully also have a chance to return to it after we've discussed Winstanley and Cone and Martin Luther King Jr. and so on. All right, so we could probably get into a long historical discussion about, exactly what made change happen. Let's try not to do that. Let's try to just focus on this question. I'm trying to Winstanley is a little bit far away from us in history, but we're dealing with these issues around us today, right? So, I welcome thoughts and responses. What do you say? Terrific, yeah. So this is starting to bring in some of the kind of just war criteria. What's going to happen to non-combatants in this case, right? In people who are just bystanders. You brought in self-defense. There's no immediate self-defense, right? This is a protest, so it's not a situation where the protesters are being attacked per se, right? But so in that sense, it's an offensive weapon. But what is it designed to do? It's designed really to get attention. So because the media aren't paying attention, nobody's really paying attention to this situation. How do you build a movement where you're able to achieve some goals because there is attention being paid to the injustices? And that's really what's driving the use of this weapon. But then the question is it proportionate to the goals that it's achieving? And what could potentially happen? What's the spiral of violence that could come from the use of this kind of a weapon? Yeah. All right, well, keep mulling all of that over here. The Christian tradition has carried Romans 13 with it in reflecting on this kind of an issue. This is a text that has had sort of outsized influence. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. This has had a longstanding influence on Christian acceptance of unjust political authorities, with the thought that somehow this is God's will, somehow we ought to accept this situation, make the best of this situation because there's an ordination of authority by God. And Jesus, too, suggests that it's possible to be faithful to God even under the reign of Caesar. Give to God what is God's, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. A kind of accommodationist response that has also encouraged Christians to think that one doesn't have a justification to resist unjust rule. In fact, perhaps one has an obligation to accept unjust rule. But of course, that's never the whole story. So James Cone's words are biting, right? As he looks at the Christian tradition and thinks about the way in which Romans 13 has had this influence. He says, Christianity has been identified with the status quo, a condition that encourages oppression and not human liberation. Challenging thing for a theologian to say, right? To remain a theologian even while saying that Christianity has been identified with the status quo, encouraging oppression. So we have Paul teaching slaves to be obedient to their masters, all to be subject to the ruling authorities. We have Augustine teaching that slavery was due to sin. It was a punishment for sin. It was therefore, in the grand scheme of things, in God's will. So as Cone identifies it, the core problem is that it is the powerful who control the interpretation of Christianity, and it's in the interests of the powerful to reinforce the status quo. Now that said, he does acknowledge that there are certain strands of the Christian tradition that supported a right of rebellion under certain circumstances, and here in particular we think of the left wing of the Protestant Reformation. So we are reading Gerard Winstanley, who is a representative of this tradition, and the most radical strand of it. This is a text from 1649, and he was a member of a group that during the English Commonwealth was involved in opposing the enclosure of common lands, so the privatization of common lands. And so how were these common lands enclosed? They were enclosed through planting hedges. And these were the diggers. This group was called the diggers, a particular group within the levelers, who were radically egalitarian groups. The diggers dug up the hedges. So resisted the enclosure of these lands by digging up the hedges and advocated common ownership of property. So a return to common lands, but then a kind of radicalization of that, of the commons. So Winstanley's Winstanley's appeal is to, trying to think about how does he make his arguments, right? What are the sources of authority that he draws on in making a defense of this? His appeal is to the pure law of equity and reason, right? So it's a kind of a natural law argument and also a scriptural argument. So he says human beings were born to freedom, not bondage. They were not made to be either tyrants or slaves. And for that, he appeals to Genesis. So we have appeal to reason or natural law and appeal to Scripture. Tyranny, he says, dishonors God. And he thinks that the end of this tyranny has been prophesied, therefore it will surely come to pass, and universal liberty will be restored. So a kind of hope or confidence that comes from prophecy. So again, reading Scripture in a way that inspires a certain kind of action. So how will tyranny be destroyed? He says it will be destroyed by the universal spreading of the divine power, which is Christ in mankind, making them all to act in one spirit and in and after one law of reason and equity. So this is an unusual way to talk about the law of reason and equity. Right? Usually this kind of natural law talk is like everybody's got it, and you just calmly draw on it in your reflection. And this is a much more apocalyptic way of thinking about it, right? So there's going to be a spreading of divine power. There's going to be a spreading of divine power in ordinary people, Christ in mankind, making them all to act in one spirit. And there's some ambiguous language here about, does this divine power make human beings act violently? And if so, does that justify the violence that human beings might enact? So he says the universal power of righteousness will destroy Babylon in 1 hour. He will pull the kingdom and government of the world out of the hands of tyrannical, unseasonable, acting flesh. So that sounds violent, right? And so then the question is, well, who is the agent of this violence? Is it God, or is it God acting in humankind? Is it humankind? But at the same time, he also sometimes speaks as though this doesn't need violence. He says, the Lord himself will do this great work without either sword or weapon. Weapons and swords shall destroy and cut the powers of the earth asunder, but they shall never build up. So here the idea seems to be, because it's divine power acting, we don't need the use of violence. It will somehow happen without that. And I think he really plays with this ambiguity. On the same page where he talks about not needing force, he does refer to breaking over hedges and eating in any pasture. So there is human agency involved in doing something, right? That is a practice of resistance. He says, when the Lord do spread himself in multiplicities of bodies, making them all of one heart and mind, acting in the righteousness of one to another. So again, there's this idea that the divine power acting in human beings acts to unify them so that things become possible that wouldn't be possible by individuals acting alone. Then again, a universal power shall rise up in the earth to pull the kingdom and outward government of the world out of the hands of the tenant Esau. So there's ambiguity about divine versus human agency. It seems to be divine agency through human agency. And so then when we get to a call to battle, a call to destroy the oppressor, it does seem as though he's issuing in a kind of a sort of apocalyptic justification for human beings to use force, but it won't be attributed, the use of force won't be attributed to them, it'll be attributed to God. And what will be no more? There will be no more domination. There will be no more lawyers. There will be no more prisons, no more engines of punishment, no more buying and selling. So we seem to have here very much an image of an eschatological new heaven and new earth. But at the same time, it seems to be this worldly. That is, he still seems to be imagining history is going on. For one thing, he imagines the need to punish even in this new kingdom. So he talks about those who break the laws of righteousness will become servants until they learn their lesson. So there will be a form of punishment needed within this new eschatological reality. So it's a very, very interesting stuff. And I think we have here a clear antecedent of liberation theology in the form of reflection, a notion of a preferential option for the poor, that God cares about the poor, those in whom the blessing lies, right? They are the ones who are compared to the younger son, Jacob, who will receive Esau's blessing, that God is raising a people for God's self out of the dust, right? Out of the lowest and despised sort of people. So I think we might listen for echoes of Winstanley in James Cone, right? He refers to this radical Protestantism. And I think we'll also hear some echoes when we get to the social gospel theology of Walter Rauschenbusch after the break. There's a similar notion of the coming of the kingdom, of a coming of the kingdom that's a revolution that is brought about by divine agency, but also somehow by human agency. So that's the most sort of radical wing of this form of reflection, but we also have a more widespread early modern or reformed resistance theory that develops in the 16th century, generally less radical than the Levelers, and it's somewhat remarkable that it develops also not just in Reformed theology, but in Lutheran theology, because Luther, when he gets started, emphasizes Romans 13. He emphasizes governmental authority. Be subject to the ruling authority. And he initially preaches non-resistance to evil and oppressive governments. So it's evolution over time that after about 1530, he begins to endorse resistance. And shortly after his death, the Lutherans joined to support Lutheran civil authorities to resist the emperor's order to return to Catholicism. So there's this sense that there's a justification here, religious justification, that was important for these Reformed resistance theories, that it was because of devotion to God that one was justified in resisting evil and oppressive governments. Calvin argued similarly. Calvin didn't endorse ordinary citizens' rebellion, but he did see that there was a duty of lesser magistrates, subordinate magistrates, should oppose unjust rule of those in authority. So I have named some of the people who were very important in developing these early modern resistance theories: John Knox, Theodore Beza, Johannes Althusius. They certainly thought the ruler should serve the common good. The ruler shouldn't simply serve their own power and wealth, but the core issue here was that the faithful were obligated to worship God, and if they're being prevented to worship in the way that they think that God requires, they should resist and not simply suffer punishment. So we can see that there's a way in which this is an extension of just war, or an application of just war criteria outside the theater of war. And in particular, that there's reflection on this question of right authority. Who has right authority to resist? And so often it was seen that the lesser magistrates are the ones that have this responsibility. But sometimes it's seen as a responsibility of the whole people. And then there's a question of, well, how can the whole people act? And in a way, we can see that that's what Winstanley was after. He said that the Spirit of Christ will enter the people and unify them so that they become an agent. Otherwise, it's really hard to coordinate whole people, right? So that's, I think, very important to bear in mind when we're thinking about, okay, kind of mainstream Christian tradition, Romans 13, very important, be subordinate to the ruling authorities, maybe a kind of slant toward being simply subject to an unjust rule, but there is this radical tradition that's there as well. So James Cone, he recognizes that this minority tradition exists within Christianity. So to some extent, he's appealing to that. His primary appeal, though, is scriptural, right? Different, right? Not to Romans 13, right? It's necessary, he says, to look beyond the white Christian tradition to the biblical tradition and reread that biblical tradition, not through the eyes of those who are in power. The content of Christian theology, he argues, is liberation. God is known in his acts of liberating, and this leads him to align black theology with black power. And he has some challenging things to say here. Christians like to say one must turn the other cheek. This renders as an untruth the unverbalized white assumption that being Christian means that black people ought to turn the other cheek. Right? As if we blacks have no moral right to defend ourselves from the encroachments of white people. So he appeals to self-defense, the right to self-defense over and against a white interpretation of turning the other cheek that is very conveniently applied, right? Very conveniently applied to those who are suffering from racial injustice. So what's he saying here? The Sermon on the Mount is being interpreted through a double standard. It's blacks who have to turn the other cheek. Whites don't need to. But it's also important to think about what he's actually calling for. Is he calling for revolution? What exactly? He's defending acts of self-defense, right? Clearly. Less clear what beyond self-defense he's calling for. So I suggested there's some resonances here with Winstanley. And notice then he calls for it. He says the rise of black theology will force American religionists to realize that no theology of the Christian gospel is possible which ignores the reality of the divine among black people in this country. Right? The Spirit of God is entering into these people. A very similar idea. Black people are prepared to live according to God's eschatological future as defined by the present reality of the black kingdom and the lives of oppressed people struggling for historical liberation. Again, echoes of Winstanley, right? We are going to live according to the eschatological future, which is already arriving because of what the Spirit of Christ is doing in people. So, is he defending the use of force? Is he calling for revolution? Well, he says this is a question that white Christians will ask. White people are not really concerned about violence per se, but only when they are the victims. He says, why do you ask this question now? Why do you ask this question? Why weren't you asking this question before? Why did we not hear from the non-violent Christians when black people were violently enslaved, violently lynched, and violently ghettoized in the name of freedom and democracy? So he's drawing attention to structural injustice that's camouflaged as law and order. There's violence going on all the time. Violence is going on when white people create a society that's for white people only, and when they do what they do to maintain that. Still, it's elusive. Is he calling for the use of force by black revolutionaries? He says only the victims of injustice can determine whether the use of force is justified. So in effect, we have no justification for sitting here trying to apply just war criteria. It's the victims of injustice who have the right to be asking that question. And he rejects any appeal to Jesus turning the other cheek, to Jesus' nonviolence. And here, the move that he makes, a very interesting move, he says, don't ask what he did, ask what he is doing. What is Jesus doing now? So again, this sort of apocalyptic, eschatological turn. What is divine agency doing now? There may be sort of radical Reformation elements here. There may also be existentialist influence here. An element of risk in decision. We have to risk. Any decision that we make, there's an element of risk, and we have to risk, we have to act. What about reconciliation? Reconciliation is premature in the face of these injustices. Reconciliation follows the the establishment of justice. So don't talk of that now. So we get a striking juxtaposition when we turn from Cone to Martin Luther King Jr. So where Cone rejects the hypocritical application of the Sermon on the Mount to blacks by whites, asking them to turn the other cheek, King appeals to the Sermon on the Mount to justify nonviolent resistance. Now, note that he doesn't take Jesus to have preached non-resistance. Right? Resistance is called for, but resistance that uses the creative weapons of love, the creative weapons of nonviolence. And nonviolent resistance is not passive, it's active. It requires courage. It is not for the fearful. Is Martin Luther King Jr. a pacifist? He doesn't reject the use of force in any and all circumstances, if that's what one means by a pacifist. He's not a pacifist. He says there's a right to self-defense. But the right to self-defense, this came up in the discussion of our scenario, right? The right to self-defense doesn't provide a positive approach to the fears and conditions which produce violence. It's dangerous, he thinks, to invoke self-defense as a ground of a revolutionary movement. Dangerous, right? So, pragmatic argument here. If you try to appeal to self-defense, you'll be seen as an aggressive force nonetheless. But he also says, not just impractical. The use of violence in this struggle would be both impractical and immoral. It would intensify hate. It would intensify evil. So he argues that nonviolent resistance is good in itself. It's not merely an expedient strategy. It's a way of life that's worthy of being embraced. Violence is a poor means to an end. What's the end? The end is redemption. The end is reconciliation. The end is the creation of beloved community. The end is not just defeat of the oppressor. The end is not just even removing the inequity. The end is, keep beloved community in sight, and then you have a different assessment of what means are actually conducive to that end. Unearned suffering has tremendous educational and transforming possibilities. To refuse to hate cuts the chains of hate. It's made possible by agape, by God's love in us, whereas hatred destroys the one who hates. So King is critical of the Black Power movement, the Black Power movement that Cone was aligning Black theology with. He says there's lots of careless talk of violence in the Black Power movement. And it's the talk, he says, of fearful people saying that they would not join the nonviolent movement because they would not remain nonviolent if they were attacked. Again, invoking self-defense. But he thinks it's not a strategy for social change. It's a strategy for occasional riots. You can make trouble, but making trouble doesn't create transformation. And we can see him working with the just war tradition here as he thinks through this. And he says, you've got to have a reasonable chance of success. Otherwise, in a war situation, it's unjust to declare a war, even if you have a just cause. So similarly, in this case, of course there's a just cause, but there's no reasonable chance of success. If you have a minority population that's confronting a well-armed, wealthy majority with a fanatical right wing that will do anything that could exterminate the entire Black population, then rioting is not an expedient means. So what is needed? Well, this is a familiar story, of course, to us. Mass mobilization, boycotts, marches, nonviolent resistance, the willingness to be arrested. So Cone is critical of Martin Luther King Jr. for premature reconciliation, right, for turning the other cheek. And Martin Luther King Jr. is critical of Black Power for loose talk about justified violence. There's just cause, but there's not probability of success. So just war criteria are not satisfied. It's unwise, and it's also unjustified to turn to the use of violence. So, where does that leave us? All right, carry this with you, folks, into the next discussion.